She was hanging her grandmother's quilt on the wall when the woman walked in without knocking. Not against the wall, not flat to the timber, the way a person might mount a decoration or cover a stain. Edna Whitfield was hanging the quilt 2 inches away from the wall, suspended on a rope, stretched between wooden pegs she had driven into the logs at shoulder height, spaced every 18 inches precise as fence posts. The quilt hung straight, behind it a gap of air, 2 inches of nothing between the fabric and the rough-hewn timber, 2 inches of emptiness that looked like a mistake. Mabel Stanton stood in the open doorway with her hands clasped at her waist and her steel-rimmed spectacles positioned at the exact angle required to communicate maximum disapproval. She was 51 years old, the wife of Reverend Stanton, and she had appointed herself the moral inventory clerk of every household within riding distance of the Three Forks settlement. She did not knock because she did not believe that charity required permission. She said, "What in heaven's name are you doing, Mrs. Whitfield?" Edna drove another peg into the log. The hammer was too heavy for her wrist, and each strike sent a jolt through the bones of her forearm that she absorbed without flinching. She was 62 years old. Her hands knew what pain cost, and they had decided long ago that the price was acceptable. She said, "Insulating." Mabel stepped inside and closed the door behind her, though she closed it the way a person closes a door they intend to open again shortly without commitment. She surveyed the cabin. 3 walls already hung with quilts, each one suspended on its rope, each one floating 2 inches from the timber, in a way that made the room look like the interior of a tent or a fabric merchant's storeroom. She said, "That's not how quilts work, Mrs. Whitfield. You're supposed to wrap yourself in them, not hang them like curtains." Edna did not stop working. She positioned the next peg, checked its alignment with her eye, and struck it twice. The sound was flat and dense in the small cabin, the sound of iron meeting wood, meeting earth. She said, "The walls let in cold. The quilts will stop it." By hanging them 2 inches from the wall, that makes no sense. A quilt against the wall might do something. A quilt floating in the air does nothing. A quilt against the wall gets cold. It conducts the chill from the logs straight into the room. A quilt 2 inches from the wall traps a layer of air that can't move. Still air doesn't conduct heat. It holds it. Mabel adjusted her spectacles. The gesture was a reflex, a way of buying time while her face assembled the appropriate expression of concerned superiority. She said, "And using your grandmother's quilts as wall hangings, that's disrespectful to the dead." Edna stepped back and checked the alignment of the rope. Straight, level, 2 inches from the timber at every point. She turned and looked at Mabel for the first time since the woman had entered her home. She said, "My grandmother would rather keep me alive than be respected in a drawer." Mabel had not come to discuss quilts. Mabel had come to discuss Edna's situation, which was Mabel's way of saying Edna's failure. The Women's Auxiliary of the Three Forks Methodist Church had been discussing Edna's situation since September, when Roscoe Whitfield had died and left his wife alone on a piece of Kansas prairie that couldn't grow enough grass to feed a rabbit. Roscoe had been 64 years old, a quiet man with a back that had begun to curve from decades of work and hands that could split a cord of oak in an afternoon without stopping to rest. He had been cutting wood for the winter on the 9th of September, preparing for the cold months ahead, doing everything right except for the single moment when the axe head glanced off a knot in the hickory and the blade caught the meat of his left palm. The cut was deep but clean. He washed it. He wrapped it. He went back to work because the wood was not going to cut itself and the winter was not going to wait. By the second day, the edges of the wound had turned the color of a sunset red, fading to purple, fading to a darkness that did not belong on living skin. By the third day, the red lines had traveled up his wrist and into his forearm, like rivers on a map, and the fever had taken hold with a grip that no amount of prayer or poultice or the bitter tea Edna brewed from willow bark could break. He died on the 12th of September in the bed they had shared for 37 years, and Edna had held his hand while the heat left his body and the room filled with a silence that was different from any silence she had known before. It was the silence of a house that had lost its second voice, the silence of a conversation that would never be finished. He had left her with a half-completed woodpile, a cabin that leaked wind from every gap between the logs, and a piece of land that would revert to the county if she could not prove up the claim by spring. He had left her with the particular loneliness of a woman who had spent nearly 4 decades calibrating her life to the rhythms of another person and now had to invent a new rhythm from nothing. The settlement expected her to sell. The settlement expected her to remarry. The settlement expected her to do what widows did on the Kansas prairie when the arithmetic of survival no longer added up. Mabel Stanton was the settlement's messenger. She said, "Several of us are concerned that you are not managing well living alone with winter coming and barely enough wood to last until Christmas. Mr. Caldwell in Dodge City, the widower, he's expressed interest in a correspondence. I could write to him on your behalf." Edna set down the hammer. She placed it on the table with a deliberateness that was more eloquent than anything she could have said. She looked at Mabel and spoke in the voice of a woman who had been alone for 2 months and had used every hour of that solitude to decide exactly who she was going to be. She said, "I'm not interested in a husband, Mrs. Stanton. I'm interested in surviving the winter. You won't survive hanging quilts on your walls. You need firewood. You need a man to cut it. You need to accept that a woman alone cannot. Thank you for your concern. The door's behind you." Mabel left. She left with her spine rigid and her shoes striking the floorboards with the precise cadence of a woman who had been dismissed from a cabin she had come to save. She climbed into the minister's wagon and she rode back to town, and before she reached the church, she had already begun composing the version of events she would distribute to every woman in the auxiliary. The widow Whitfield had lost her mind. The widow Whitfield was hanging quilts on walls. The widow Whitfield was living in a cabin that looked like a dry goods store and refusing perfectly good advice from women who knew better. It would be December before anyone checked on her again. They assumed the cold would do the persuading that Mabel could not. Edna went to the wood pile the morning after Mabel's visit. The pile stood behind the cabin, stacked against the south wall where Roscoe had always kept it covered with a canvas tarp he had weighted down with stones. It looked substantial from a distance. It looked like a winter's worth of fuel, maybe 4 months of heat, enough to carry a household through the worst of what Kansas could deliver between November and March. Edna pulled back the tarp and put her hands on the wood. The top 2 rows were sound. Dry hickory and oak split clean-aged properly. She knocked on each piece with her knuckle and heard the dense resonant tone of wood that would burn slow and hot. Good fuel. Honest fuel. The 3rd row was different. She pulled a piece of hickory from the stack and felt it give under her fingers. The bark was intact, but beneath it the wood was soft, spongy, discolored. She pressed her thumb into the grain, and it sank half an inch without resistance. She brought the piece to her nose and smelled the sweet, rotting scent of moisture that had been working its way through the cellulose for weeks. She checked the 4th row. Worse. The 5th row worse still. The bottom 3 rows, the ones closest to the ground, the ones that had been sitting in the mud that September's rains had created, were ruined. Not entirely. Some pieces might burn, but they would burn fast with more smoke than heat consuming themselves in a flash of damp combustion that would warm the room for 20 minutes and then leave nothing but gray ash and the memory of effort. Edna stood in front of the wood pile and did the arithmetic. She was good at arithmetic. She had always been good at arithmetic, even as a girl, even before she married Roscoe, and moved to a piece of ground where arithmetic was the difference between eating and not eating. She could calculate yield per acre in her head. She could estimate the weight of a hay bale by looking at it. She could tell you within a quarter cord how much wood a stack contained. The stack in front of her contained approximately 6 cords. But only 3.5 of those cords were burnable. The rest was rot and moisture and the particular cruelty of a rain that falls after a man dies and before his wife can finish what he started. 3.5 cords. In a cabin with log walls that leaked wind through every crack and gap, with a single wood stove that had to burn day and night to keep the temperature above freezing, 3.5 cords of wood would last 6 weeks. Maybe 7 if she rationed. Maybe 5 if December was bad. Kansas winters lasted 4 months. Edna covered the wood pile and went inside. She sat at the table and placed her hands flat on the surface and looked at them. They were the hands of a 62-year-old woman, veined, spotted, the knuckles swollen into shapes that ached when the weather changed. They were not the hands of a person who could cut 3 additional cords of firewood before the snow came. They were not the hands of a person who could swing an axe for 8 hours a day and survive the week. She did not panic. Panic was for people who had not yet done the math. Edna had done the math. The math said she would run out of wood in mid-January. The math said that after the mid-January, the temperature in her cabin would drop to match the temperature outside, which in a Kansas January meant somewhere between 0 and 20 below. The math said she would freeze. She sat with this knowledge for an hour. She sat with it the way you sit with a diagnosis, not fighting it, not denying it, just letting it take its shape in the room so you could see it clearly and decide what to do about it. Then she got up, put on her coat, and walked to town. The general store in Three Forks smelled of coffee beans leather and the faint kerosene tang that hung in every building where oil lamps burned through the short autumn days. Edna did not go there often. She did not enjoy the way the clerk looked at her, the particular tilt of the head that people use when they are deciding whether to feel sorry for you or afraid of you. She was looking for wool yarn. She was not sure why she was looking for wool yarn, because she had no specific project in mind and no money to spare on materials she did not need. But the store was warm, and she was not ready to go home, and sometimes the act of being among objects you could touch and weigh and evaluate was enough to keep the mind from spiraling. She heard the voice before she saw the woman. It was a voice with an accent, thick and rounded, the consonants softened by a language that had been spoken first and never fully replaced. The voice was talking about Sweden. Mrs. Bergstrom was standing near the yarn bins, holding a skein of gray wool in her right hand and addressing the empty air in front of her with the comfortable authority of a woman who had long since stopped caring whether anyone was listening. She was 78 years old, small, with silver braids pinned in a crown on her head, and a face that had been weathered by a lifetime split between two continents. She had come to Kansas from Uppsala in 1851, 34 years ago, and she had never stopped talking about the country she had left. Most people avoided her. She was old. She was foreign. She talked too much. The clerk tolerated her because she bought yarn every week, whether she needed it or not, and because the alternative was asking her to leave, which would have required an argument that no one in Three Forks had the energy to win. Edna stopped beside the yarn bins and listened. She listened because she had nowhere else to be. She listened because the sound of another woman's voice, even a voice talking about a country 6,000 miles away, was a comfort she had not realized she needed. She listened because the math in her head was still running, still producing the same answer, and she needed something, anything, to interrupt the calculation. Mrs. Bergstrom was talking about winter. Not Kansas winter, but Swedish winter. The kind that lasted 6 months and arrived in a darkness that was not just the absence of light, but the presence of something heavier. She was talking about how the farmers in Uppsala had survived those winters, not by burning more wood, but by understanding where the heat went. She said, "In Sweden, we learned that still air does not conduct heat." Edna looked at her. Mrs. Bergstrom continued, unaware or unconcerned that she now had an audience. She said, "Moving air, yes, it steals the warmth and carries it away. A draft through a wall, a crack in a door, the wind through a window frame. Moving air is a thief. But air that cannot move, air that is trapped in a space where it has no room to circulate that air, is like a blanket. It holds the warmth, it stops the cold." She held up the skein of yarn as though it were evidence. Still air, dead air we called it, air that does nothing. And in doing nothing, it does everything. Edna took a step closer. She said, "How do you trap it?" Mrs. Bergstrom looked at her. The old woman's eyes were blue, faded to the color of winter sky, and they held the particular brightness of a person who has been waiting for someone to ask the right question. She said, "You hang a curtain 2 inches from a cold wall. The air between the curtain and the wall comes dead air. It cannot move. It cannot steal your heat. The cold from the wall hits the dead air and stops. Your room stays warm." She held up 2 fingers 2 inches apart and looked at the gap between them, as though she could see the air trapped there motionless doing its invisible work. 2 inches, she said. Not 1, not 3, 2. 1 inch is too thin. The air can still circulate. 3 inches is too wide. Convection currents form and the air begins to move again, carrying heat to the wall and cold to the room. 2 inches is the sweet point. 2 inches of dead air will change everything. Edna stared at the woman's fingers. 2 inches, the width of a walnut, the width of nothing, the width of the difference between freezing to death in January and surviving until spring. She said, "What do you use for the curtain?" Mrs. Bergstrom smiled. It was the smile of a woman who had been saying the same thing for 34 years and had finally found someone who was not going to nod politely and walk away. She said, "Anything dense, wool, canvas, quilts if you have them. The thicker the fabric, the better it holds the dead air in place." The north wall gets the heaviest material because the north wall faces the wind that comes down from the Arctic without anything to stop it. Heavy quilts on the north wall, lighter fabric on the east and west, and the door you must seal the door. A curtain 3 feet inside the doorway, creating a space between the outside door and the inner curtain. We called it a wind trap. Cold air that gets past the door hits the inner curtain and stops. It never reaches the room. Edna stood in the general store in Three Forks, Kansas, holding a skein of wool she was not going to buy, and she felt something shift behind her sternum. Not hope. She was too old and too practical for hope. It was recognition. The recognition that the answer to her problem had been spoken aloud in a language she could understand by a woman everyone else had dismissed. She said, "Thank you, Mrs. Bergstrom." The old woman nodded. She turned back to the yarn bins and resumed her conversation with the empty air. And Edna walked out of the store and into the October afternoon, and the wind hit her face with the familiar cold that she had been fighting for 2 months. But she was not fighting it anymore. She was thinking about it. She was thinking about where the heat went and how to stop it from going there. She was thinking about 2 inches. She went home and looked at her cabin with new eyes. The walls were cottonwood logs chinked with mud and straw that Roscoe had packed into the gaps when they first built the place in 1868. The chinking was cracked. Some of it had fallen out entirely, leaving gaps between the logs that she could see daylight through. When the wind blew from the north, she could feel it on her skin from 6 feet away, a cold current that entered the cabin through 100 invisible channels and drained the warmth from the room, the way water drains from a cracked bucket. She could stuff more mud into the cracks. She had done this every fall for 17 years, pressing the gray clay into the gaps with her fingers and smoothing it with a wet cloth. But mud took days to dry, and if it froze before it set, it would crack again and fall out before Christmas. And even perfect chinking would not solve the fundamental problem, which was that the logs themselves conducted cold. The timber was a bridge between the outside air and the inside air, a highway of conduction that transferred the temperature of the prairie directly into her home. She could hang blankets flat against the walls, but she understood now why that would fail. A blanket pressed against cold wood would absorb the cold from the wood and radiate it into the room. The blanket would become the wall. It would be cold fabric instead of cold timber, but the result would be the same. But a blanket hung 2 inches from the wall. That was different. That was a blanket with a secret, because between the blanket and the wall there would be a layer of air, and that air trapped in a space too narrow for convection, too enclosed for drafts, would simply stop. It would become dead air. And dead air, according to a 78-year-old Swedish woman who bought yarn she didn't need and talked to the empty spaces in a general store, did not conduct heat. Edna went to the cedar chest at the foot of her bed. She opened the lid and looked at the quilts inside. There were 7 of them. Each one was a biography stitched in cotton and batting. The top 2 had been made by her grandmother, Eleanor Riddle, in a farmhouse in central Illinois in the 1830s. They were heavy, thick batted quilts in the double wedding ring pattern, made for warmth rather than beauty, filled with carded wool that still held its loft after 50 years. Beneath them were 3 quilts her mother had given her when she married Roscoe Leiter, but tightly stitched in patterns called bear paw and log cabin. At the bottom, folded in tissue, was the quilt she and Roscoe had bought together in Wichita on their honeymoon, a star pattern in blue and white that they had chosen because it reminded them of the Kansas sky on the night they decided to head west. 7 quilts, 4 walls, 2 inches of air. She carried her grandmother's heaviest quilt to the north wall and began driving pegs. It took her 2 days. She worked from dawn until the light failed, stopping only to eat and to rest her hands when the swelling in her knuckles made it impossible to grip the hammer. She used wooden pegs because she had no nails to spare, and because wooden pegs, unlike iron nails, would not conduct cold through the wall and into the rope. She spaced them every 18 inches, drove them deep into the logs, and strung a rope between them at a height that kept the bottom edge of each quilt 1 inch above the floor. 2 inches of gap. She checked it obsessively. She cut a small block of wood exactly 2 inches wide and used it as a gauge, sliding it between the quilt and the wall at every peg point, adjusting the rope tension until the gap was uniform from floor to ceiling, from corner to corner. The north wall got her grandmother's heaviest quilts, both of them overlapping at the center, to ensure no section of timber was exposed. The east and west walls got the lighter quilts. The south wall, which held the cabin's single window, got the star quilt from Wichita, hung on a rod that allowed it to be pulled aside during the day to admit what little winter sun Kansas offered. She sealed the gaps around the door with strips of wool cut from an old blanket that had been too threadbare to use on the bed. She packed the strips into the frame with the back of a butter knife, creating a gasket that blocked the drafts that had whistled through the doorway every time the wind shifted. Then she hung a second curtain. A heavy canvas drop cloth she had found in the shed 3 feet inside the door were suspended from a rope that ran wall to wall. The curtain created a small vestibule between the outside door and the living space, an airlock, a wind trap, a dead zone where the cold air that managed to get past the sealed door would hit the canvas and stop unable to reach the room where the stove burned. By the time she finished, the cabin looked like nothing she had ever lived in. Walls covered in quilts, door wrapped in wool, curtains where no curtains should be. It looked like the inside of a quilt itself, a soft enclosed space that seemed smaller than before, but felt for the first time like it might be possible to defend. She lit the stove at 5 in the afternoon. She used the good wood, the dry hickory from the top of the pile, and she built the fire the way Roscoe had taught her, a base of split kindling, topped with 2 medium pieces arranged to create a draft channel that would draw the flames upward and distribute the heat evenly through the cast iron. Then she sat in her chair at the table and waited. The difference came within an hour. She felt it first in the quality of the air. It was not just warmer, it was stiller. The faint, constant movement that she had lived with for 17 years, the invisible currents that circulated through the cabin as warm air rose from the stove and was replaced by cold air seeping through the walls, had stopped. The air in the room was motionless. The quilts hung straight and still on their ropes, not a ripple, not a sway. The dead air behind them was doing its work, absorbing the cold from the timber and holding it in place, preventing it from crossing the 2-inch gap and entering the room. The room was warm, not the desperate temporary warmth of a stove burning at full capacity, the kind of warmth that lasted only as long as the fuel held out and disappeared the moment you stopped feeding it. This was a different warmth, a quieter warmth, the kind of warmth that settled into the walls of the room itself, that soaked into the quilts and the floorboards and the air between the objects, building a reservoir of heat that did not require constant replenishment. She sat at the table and felt her shoulders drop. She had not realized they were raised, had not noticed the tension she had been carrying in her neck and her back since September, the physical posture of a body that was always bracing against the next gust of cold. The tension released, and she breathed, and the breath was warm going in and warm going out, and she took off her shawl and folded it on the back of the chair because she did not need it. She did not need it. At 9 o'clock, she banked the stove for the night. She reduced the fire to a bed of coals and closed the damper, halfway cutting the air supply to the minimum that would keep the coals alive until morning. In a normal winter, this would have meant waking at 2 or 3 in the morning, shivering to rebuild the fire from scratch. In a normal winter, the heat from a bank stove would have been sucked through the walls and into the Kansas night within an hour, leaving the cabin at the mercy of whatever temperature the prairie had decided on. She went to bed. She pulled the remaining quilts over herself, the ones that were not hanging on the walls, and she closed her eyes, and she expected to wake up freezing, as she had every night since Roscoe died. She woke at dawn. The room was warm. The fire was still burning in its bed of coals, a low orange glow that pulsed gently with each breath of air from the damper. The thermometer that hung beside the door, the one Roscoe had bought at the hardware store in Wichita, read 49 degrees. It was not summer. It was not even comfortable by the standards of a person who had never lived through a Kansas winter. But it was 49 degrees at 6 in the morning in late October with a bank stove and no fire, and outside the temperature was 23. The dead air had held the heat all night. Edna sat on the edge of her bed and looked at the quilts on the walls. Her grandmother's quilts. Her mother's quilts. The quilt she had bought with Roscoe on a summer afternoon in Wichita when they were both young enough to believe that the future was a place you could ride to. They were hanging on her walls. They were 2 inches from the timber. They were holding the warmth inside her home the way they had once held the warmth inside her body, and the physics were the same, and the principle was the same, and the love stitched into every seam was doing exactly what love had always done. It was keeping her alive. She got up. She stoked the fire. She made coffee, and she did not think about Mabel Stanton or the Women's Auxiliary or the widower in Dodge City or any of the people who had already decided that a 62-year-old woman alone on the Kansas prairie was a problem that could only be solved by surrender. She thought about 2 inches. She thought about dead air. She thought about the fact that the gap between things could matter more than the things themselves. And somewhere in the settlement, Mabel Stanton was telling anyone who would listen that the widow Whitfield had finally lost her grip, that she was hanging quilts on walls like a lunatic, that she was making a spectacle of herself, and that when she froze to death in January, they would all have to deal with the consequences. The word spread. The word always spread. In a settlement of 300 people with no newspaper and no entertainment beyond gossip and the weather, the story of the quilt widow traveled from household to household like a cold draft through an unsealed door. Edna did not hear it. Edna was inside her cabin, sitting in a chair, drinking coffee that stayed warm all morning, listening to the silence of air that had decided not to move. 2 inches of nothing, doing everything. December arrived the way winter always arrives in Kansas. Not gradually, not with the courtesy of a warning. It arrived like a sentence handed down by a court that did not accept appeals. The sky turned the color of old iron, and the wind came from the north with a constancy that suggested it had no other obligations and no intention of stopping. The temperature dropped below freezing on the 3rd of December and did not rise above it for 11 consecutive days. The ground hardened to a depth that made fence post driving impossible. The water in the horse troughs formed ice so thick the animals had to be watered from buckets heated on the stove. The world contracted. The horizon, which in summer stretched to infinity in every direction, pulled inward during winter, until the visible universe consisted of the cabin, the woodpile, the outhouse, and the 40 feet of frozen ground between them. Edna Whitfield fed her stove twice a day. This was the fact that would have astonished anyone in the settlement if they had known it. Twice a day. Once in the morning when she opened the damper and added 2 pieces of split hickory to the bed of coals that had survived the night. Once in the evening when she added 2 more pieces and adjusted the damper for the overnight burn. 4 pieces of wood per day. In a cabin that was warm enough to sit in without a shawl. In a cabin where the coffee pot on the stove stayed warm from morning until dark. In a cabin where the quilts on the walls hung motionless on their ropes, holding the line between cold and warm with the silent discipline of sentinels. 4 pieces of wood per day. Her neighbors were burning 12, some were burning 16. The Nettleton family half a mile east kept their stove so hot that the iron glowed red at the seams, and they were still cold because the heat they produced was being pulled through their log walls and donated to the prairie the moment it was created. They were fighting the cold. They were losing. They would always lose because fighting the cold meant matching its energy with your own calorie for calorie, cord for cord, and the cold had more energy than any woodpile in Kansas. Edna was not fighting the cold. Edna had stopped fighting the cold the day she hung the first quilt. She had done something much more radical than fighting. She had refused to participate. She had sealed her cabin, trapped the air, killed the drafts, and told the cold that it was welcome to freeze the walls as hard as it pleased because the walls were no longer connected to the room. 2 inches of dead air stood between the outside temperature and the inside temperature, and those 2 inches were an absence that the cold could not cross. The math was elegant. A log wall conducted heat at a rate determined by the thermal conductivity of the wood, the thickness of the wall, and the temperature differential between inside and outside. For a typical cottonwood log wall 12 inches thick with an inside temperature of 50 degrees and an outside temperature of 0, the heat loss was approximately 35 British thermal units per hour per square foot. Edna's cabin had roughly 400 square feet of wall surface, which meant she was losing 14,000 BTUs per hour through the walls alone. 14,000 BTUs. That was the equivalent of burning 1 pound of dry hardwood every 30 minutes just to maintain the temperature. Not to warm the cabin, just to keep it from getting colder. The stove had to burn continuously, voraciously consuming wood at a rate that would exhaust a 6-cord supply by the end of January. But the quilts changed the equation. 2 inches of trapped air had an insulating value roughly equivalent to 4 additional inches of solid wood. The quilts themselves added another inch of effective insulation. The combined effect reduced the heat loss through the walls by more than half. 14,000 BTUs per hour became 6,000. 1 pound of wood every 30 minutes became 1 pound every 70 minutes. A 6-cord supply that would have been gone by January would now last until April. Edna did not know these numbers. She did not have a table of thermal conductivities or a formula for calculating to loss. She had something better. She had the woodpile, and she had the calendar, and she had the ability to count. She counted the pieces of wood she burned each day. She counted the days since the cold began. She estimated the remaining volume of the pile. The pile was barely shrinking. It was December 23rd, and the pile looked almost exactly as it had on November 1st. She had burned less than a cord in nearly 2 months. At this rate, her 3.5 cords of good wood would carry her through the winter and into spring with fuel to spare. The rotted wood, which she had stacked separately and written off as waste, could serve as emergency reserve, burned in small quantities mixed with the good wood to extend the supply even further. She was going to make it. She stood in the cold beside the woodpile on the morning of Christmas Eve and understood this fact with the same clarity that she had understood 2 months earlier that she was going to die. The math had said death. She had changed the math. And now the math said life. She carried 2 pieces of hickory inside and fed the stove and sat down to drink her coffee, and the cabin was warm and the quilts hung straight and the dead air held. The town did not stop talking. The town was constitutionally incapable of not talking. In a settlement where winter reduced the available activities to feeding livestock, splitting wood, and speculating about the private lives of neighbors, the story of the quilt widow was the most durable entertainment of the season. Mabel Stanton maintained the narrative with the consistency of a church bell. She rang it every Sunday in the vestibule, after services every Wednesday at the women's auxiliary meeting, and every time she encountered another human being at the general store, the post office, or the wells where the women gathered to break ice and draw water. "It's not natural," she said to the cluster of women at the well on the second Saturday of December. "Quilts belong on beds, not walls. She's living in a cabin that looks like a fabric store. Her grandmother is spinning in her grave." "Has anyone been out there?" asked Mrs. Nettleton, whose own cabin was so cold that her children slept in their coats. "I went in October, before the cold." She was hammering pegs into the walls and hanging quilts like laundry on a line. 2 inches from the wall, she said. "Told me it was insulation." I told her it was nonsense. "Is she still alive?" asked a younger woman named Ruth Tolliver, who had moved to the settlement that spring and was experiencing her first Kansas winter with the wide-eyed dread of the uninitiated. "She's alive because the real cold hasn't hit yet. Wait until January. Wait until the wind comes down from Canada and stays for a month. No amount of quilts on walls is going to keep that cabin warm when it's 20 below and the stove can't keep up. She'll come crawling. They always do." The women nodded, not because they agreed with certainty, but because Mabel spoke with the authority of a woman who had never been wrong about anything, and disagreeing with Mabel was an expenditure of social capital that none of them could afford. But Ruth Tolliver went home that evening and looked at the walls of her own cabin and felt the cold seeping through the logs and thought about quilts. January came. January in Kansas was not a month, it was a test. It was the Earth's way of asking whether you had prepared adequately or whether you had been fooling yourself, and the answer was delivered in the language of temperature, which did not negotiate and did not lie. The first week of January brought a sustained cold that settled over the plains like a weight. The thermometer outside Edna's cabin read 4 degrees above zero at noon and 12 below at dawn. The sky was cloudless and crystalline, which meant there was no insulating layer of overcast to moderate the radiation of heat from the ground into space. The earth was bleeding warmth into the void, and everything on its surface was bleeding with it. In the settlement, the wood piles were shrinking visibly. The Nettleton family sent their eldest son to the creek bottom to cut green cottonwood, which burned with a smoky, reluctant flame that produced heat the way a miser produces charity grudgingly and in insufficient quantities. Reverend Stanton's church, a frame building with single plank walls and gaps around every window, had consumed 11 cords of wood by the second week of January and showed no signs of slowing. The Reverend himself could be seen at dawn each morning, splitting wood behind the church in the gray light, his breath billowing, his axe falling, with the metronomic desperation of a man trying to outrun arithmetic. Mabel fed 2 stoves, one in the parlor, one in the kitchen. She kept them both burning from 5 in the morning until 10 at night, And still the frost crept across the inside of the window glass, and the water bucket by the door formed a skin of ice by midnight. Her wood pile, which had started the season at 10 cords of supply, she and the Reverend had considered generous, was down to 4.5. It was January 15th. There were 10 weeks of winter remaining. Edna Whitfield had burned 2 cords. She knew this because she counted. She counted every piece of wood she carried inside, and she kept a tally on a piece of paper tacked to the wall beside the stove. 4 pieces a day, sometimes 5 on the coldest nights for 77 days. Roughly 2 cords. Her remaining supply was more than adequate. She would finish the winter with wood to spare. The cabin held at 48 degrees on the coldest mornings and 55 on the warmest afternoons. She wore a wool dress and a light shawl. She drank warm coffee. She read the almanac that Roscoe had bought the previous spring, the one with the planting tables and the weather predictions that were always wrong but always entertaining. She lived a life that from the inside did not feel like survival. It felt like residence. It felt like home. But the nights were long. It happened on the 17th of January, the coldest night of the winter so far. Edna woke at 3 in the morning and did not know why. She lay in the dark and listened. The stove was ticking, the sound of cast iron contracting as the fire burned low, a sound she had learned to read the way a sailor reads the rigging. The tick rate told her the fire was down to coals. Not dead, but close. Perhaps an hour from going out entirely. She should get up. She should open the damper and add a piece of wood and coax the coals back to life. She had done this 100 times. It was a mechanical act, a thing the body could do while the mind was still asleep. But she did not get up. She lay in the dark and felt the silence. It was not the silence of peace. It was not the comfortable silence of a house at rest. It was the silence of absence. The silence of a room that contained one person where there had always been 2. The silence of 3 in the morning in January in Kansas when the world outside was frozen to a hardness that rejected life, and the world inside was a small pocket of warmth that existed only because one woman was sustaining it. And if that woman stopped sustaining it, stopped getting up, stopped feeding the fire, stopped counting the wood and checking the quilts and adjusting the damper shoe, the warmth would disappear and the cabin would equalize with the outside temperature, and everything she had built would become as cold and still as the body of the man she had buried in September. The loneliness hit her like a physical thing. Not the ordinary loneliness of being alone, the kind she had managed to keep at arm's length through work and calculation and the daily discipline of purpose. This was the deeper loneliness, the one that waited for 3 in the morning. The one that arrived only when the defenses were down and the mind was too tired to maintain the fiction that competence was the same as company. She lay in the dark and listened to the stove talking and the wind pressing against the north wall, and she thought about Mabel Stanton. She thought about the widower in Dodge City. She thought about the women at the well and the word they used to describe her, which was not brave or resourceful or clever, but strange. The quilt widow, the strange woman who hung quilts on walls and lived alone and refused to do what widows were supposed to do. She thought, is she right? Not about the quilts. The quilts worked. The physics were beyond argument. But about the rest of it, about a woman alone, about a 62-year-old woman with swollen knuckles and a curved spine lying in the dark at 3 in the morning, in the middle of January, in the middle of Kansas, with no one who would know if she died in her sleep. No one who would find her until the smell reached the road, or until spring came and someone wondered why the chickens were loose. She lay there for a long time. The stove ticked. The wind pressed. The dark was complete. Then she reached out her hand and touched the quilt on the wall beside her bed. The side facing her was warm, room temperature. The heat of the cabin absorbed into the fabric over hours of steady, quiet exposure. She pressed her palm flat against it and felt the warmth conduct into her skin. Then she slid her fingers behind the quilt into the 2-inch gap and touched the back. Cold. The back of the quilt, the side facing the wall, was cold. Not freezing, but markedly cooler than the front. The temperature differential was clear and immediate readable through the nerve endings of her fingertips with the precision of a thermometer. The dead air was holding. The quilt was warm on one side and cold on the other, and between the two a layer of motionless air was standing guard, conducting nothing, transferring nothing, holding the line between the warmth of her life and the cold of the world that wanted to take it. The physics had not changed. The physics would not change. The physics did not care that it was 3 in the morning or that she was alone or that the silence in the room was the kind that could convince you that nothing mattered. The physics cared only about temperature and conductivity and the behavior of air in a 2-inch gap. And on those subjects, the physics were certain. Edna withdrew her hand. She got up. She opened the damper and placed a piece of hickory on the coals and watched the flame catch and grow. She put the kettle on and waited for the water to heat and made herself a cup of tea. She sat at the table in the warm cabin at 3:30 in the morning and drank the tea, and the stove crackled and the quilts hung motionless in the dead air held. And she understood something about herself that she had not understood before. She was not brave. She had never been brave. Bravery was a word for people who acted without knowing the outcome. Edna always knew the outcome because Edna always did the math. She had measured the gap. She had counted the wood. She had calculated the rate of loss and the rate of replacement and the number of days between now and spring. She was not brave. She was precise. And precision, it turned out, was enough. She finished her tea and went back to bed and slept until dawn. And when she woke, the room was warm and the fire was alive, and the quilts on the walls had not moved. It was in the 3rd week of January that the quilt fell. Not all of it, one corner. The peg on the northeast corner of the north wall, the one she had driven at shoulder height on the 2nd day of installation, worked loose during the night. The log it was set in had a grain that ran at an angle, and the repeated contraction and expansion of the wood in the cold had gradually widened the hole until the peg lost its bite and slid free. The corner of the quilt dropped. Instead of hanging 2 inches from the wall, it sagged inward and pressed flat against the timber. The dead air gap in that corner collapsed. The quilt touched the wall. Edna discovered it in the morning when she got up to stoke the fire. She saw the sag immediately. The corner of the quilt was flat against the logs, wrinkled where it had bunched against the rough surface. She reached behind it to check the gap and found none. The fabric was in direct contact with the wood. She fixed it in 10 minutes. She carved a new peg from a piece of hardwood scrap, drove it into a fresh section of the log, and rehung the corner, checking the gap with her 2-inch gauge. The quilt returned to its proper position, floating free of the wall, the air gap restored. But she did not need the gauge to know what had happened during the night. The evidence was on the wall. The section of log behind the fallen corner was covered in frost. A thin white crystalline layer of ice had formed on the timber surface, condensed from the warm, moist air of the cabin, meeting the cold surface of the log that was no longer insulated. The frost covered an area roughly 2 feet square, matching exactly the section where the quilt had been in contact with the wall. The rest of the north wall was dry. Every section where the quilt still hung at its proper 2-inch distance, every section where the dead air gap was intact, was dry and frost-free. The cold had reached the wall, but it had not reached the room. The dead air had stopped it. But in the one corner where the quilt had touched the wall, where the dead air had been eliminated, the cold had come through. It had crossed the gap in hours. It had deposited its signature in frost that was as clear and legible as a signature on a contract. Edna stood in front of the wall and looked at the evidence. One square of frost in a wall of dry timber. One failure in a system of success. One gap where the dead air had died and the cold had walked through. She touched the frost with her fingertip. It was real. It was cold. It was the proof she had not known she needed. Not proof that the system worked. She already knew the system worked. She had known it since the first night. This was proof of something more precise. This was proof that the system was the only thing that worked. Remove the dead air, even in one corner, even for one night, and the cold came through immediately. The quilts were not decorations. The 2-inch gap was not a theory. It was the single variable that stood between her and the temperature of the Kansas night. She redrove the peg and straightened the quilt and checked every other peg on every other wall and tightened every rope and measured every gap. Then she made a note on the piece of paper beside the stove in the careful handwriting of a woman who recorded everything because recording was a form of control and control was a form of survival. January 22nd, northeast corner, peg failed. Frost on wall behind fallen quilt. All other walls dry. Dead air is the difference. 2 inches is not optional. The frost melted by noon. By evening, the wall was dry again, indistinguishable from every other section. The dead air had resumed its work, silent and invisible, holding the line. February came, the coldest month, the month that tested the margin between adequate preparation and insufficient preparation, between enough wood and not enough wood, between a cabin that held its heat and a cabin that surrendered it. Edna had burned approximately 4 cords. She knew this from her tally sheet. She knew the number the way she knew her own name, because the number was in a sense her name. It was the measure of her survival. It was the distance she had traveled from the day in October when the math said death to this day in February when the math said life. 4 cords, maybe 4.5 if she was generous with the estimate. It was a number that would mean nothing to anyone who had not lived through a Kansas winter in a log cabin with a single wood stove. But to anyone who had it was an impossibility. 4 cords was what a well-built cabin burned in December alone, not what it burned from November through February. 4 cords was a miracle. 4 cords was a violation of everything the settlement believed about the relationship between wood and warmth in winter. Mabel Stanton had burned 9. Mabel Stanton arrived on a Tuesday afternoon in the second week of February, riding in the minister's wagon, wrapped in so many layers of wool and cotton and fur-trimmed canvas that she resembled a geological formation more than a human being. She was a boulder of fabric mounted on a wagon seat, her face visible only as a narrow strip of pink skin between her hat brim and her scarf, her spectacles fogged with condensation from her own breath. Edna was outside when the wagon appeared. She was feeding the chickens, scattering grain from a tin pail, wearing a wool dress and a light shawl. Her head was uncovered. Her hands were bare. She stood in the February air at 18 degrees above zero and performed a domestic task with the unhurried calm of a woman who was not cold. Mabel saw her from the road. The image registered with the force of a contradiction. A 62-year-old woman, outdoors, in February, in a light shawl, not shivering, not hunched, not exhibiting any of the physical symptoms of a person who was losing the war against winter. The wagon stopped. Mabel did not dismount immediately. She sat on the bench and looked at Edna and at the woodpile behind the cabin, which was visibly larger than any woodpile in the settlement had any right to be in February. And the expression on the narrow strip of face between hat and scarf underwent a sequence of adjustments that Edna observed with quiet attention. Mabel said, "Mrs. Whitfield, I've come to see how you're managing." Edna scattered the last of the grain. She turned and faced the minister's wife with the level, unhurried gaze that had become her default expression since October, the gaze of a woman who had been measuring everything and found that the measurements were in her favor. She said, "I'm managing fine, Mrs. Stanton. Better than fine. I notice your wood pile seems larger than I expected for February." "Does it?" Edna set down the pail. She looked at Mabel the way a teacher looks at a student who has arrived at a lesson they did not want to learn. She said, "Would you like to come inside and see why Mabel did not want to come inside?" Mabel had spent 4 months telling every person in the settlement that the quilt widow would freeze, that her quilted walls were foolishness, that she would come crawling for help before Christmas. It was now February, and the quilt widow was standing in the cold in a light shawl, and the wood pile that should have been a memory was still half full, and the predictions that Mabel had distributed with such confidence had curdled into something that tasted like a question she did not want to answer. But she climbed down from the wagon. She followed Edna to the door. She waited while Edna opened the outer door, stepped through the wind trap, pushed aside the canvas curtain, and held it open. The warmth hit Mabel like a wave. It was not the gradual warmth of a room you walked into and slowly adjusted to. It was immediate. It was a wall of warm air that pressed against her frozen face and her frozen hands and her frozen expectations with a physical force that made her stop in the doorway and blink. The cabin was warm, not just not cold, warm. The kind of warm that Mabel associated with houses that had 2 stoves burning all day and a man to feed them. But there was only one stove in Edna Whitfield's cabin, and it was barely burning. The fire inside was a low bed of coals topped with a single piece of hickory that crackled softly, almost apologetically, as though it knew it was doing less work than anyone expected. Mabel stood in the center of the room and turned in a slow circle. She saw the quilts. She saw them on every wall, hanging on their ropes, floating 2 inches from the timber, motionless and straight. She saw the curtain by the door. She saw the sealed window frame. She saw the stove that was barely lit in the room that was warmer than her own parlor, where 2 fires burned from dawn until night. She said, "How Her voice was different. Edna heard it immediately. The usual certainty, the ironclad confidence that Mabel wore like her steel-rimmed spectacles was gone. The voice that came out was smaller, stripped, the voice of a woman standing in the wreckage of something she had believed. "How is it this warm? You've barely got a fire going." Edna gestured at the walls, at the quilts, at the 2-inch gaps that were invisible from the center of the room but present everywhere, silent and absolute. She said, "The quilts trap a layer of air between themselves and the walls. The air can't move, so it can't carry the heat away. The cold from the walls hits the dead air and stops. The warmth stays in the room instead of bleeding out through the logs. That's not possible. It's happening right now. You're standing in it." Edna pulled a chair from the table and gestured for Mabel to sit. She said, "Would you like some coffee? The pot's been warm all morning. Doesn't take much heat to keep it that way when the heat doesn't escape." Mabel sat. She accepted the coffee. She drank it. She looked at the quilts on the walls, at the curtain by the door, at the stove that was barely burning, at the room that was warmer than her own house, where she and the Reverend burned wood from dawn until dark in 2 stoves that could not keep up with the cold. She said, "How much wood have you burned this winter?" "About 4 cords, maybe 4.5. 4 cords. The words came out flat, neutral. The voice of a woman who was hearing a number that dismantled everything she had built her winter around. Edna said, "How much have you burned?" 9, the word hung in the warm air between them. 9 palm, 9 cords of wood, 9 cords of labor, of splitting and stacking and carrying and feeding, of getting up at 4 in the morning to rebuild a fire that the walls had consumed by midnight. 9 cords of her husband's labor of axe and sweat and the daily sacrifice of energy to a system that was fundamentally flawed because it tried to fill a room with heat while the room poured that heat through its walls and into the infinite appetite of the Kansas winter. Edna sipped her coffee. She watched Mabel over the rim of the cup. She felt no triumph. Triumph was a surface emotion, like pride, like anger, like the satisfaction of being right when someone else was wrong. She felt something quieter. She felt the steady level warmth of the room she had built, and she understood that the room was the answer, and the answer did not require her to say anything else. But she said one more thing. She set down her salt and leaned forward and looked directly into the eyes of the woman who had wanted her to fail. She said, "You told everyone I would freeze. You told everyone I needed a husband. You told everyone a woman alone couldn't survive a Kansas winter." She paused. The quilts hung motionless on the walls. The dead air held. She said, "How's that working out for you, Mrs. Stanton?" Mabel set down her coffee. She did not finish it. She stood and walked to the door and pushed through the canvas curtain and through the wind trap and into the February cold, and she climbed onto the minister's wagon and took the reins and drove back toward town without looking back. Edna watched her go from the window through the gap in the star quilt that she pulled aside to let in the winter sun. She watched the wagon diminish against the white horizon until it was a dark point and then a memory. Then she let the quilt fall back into place and returned to her chair and her coffee and the warm, still silent room that 2 inches of nothing had made possible. The word spread differently after that. It spread not as mockery, but as curiosity, which was a different kind of wind, the kind that carried seeds instead of dust. People began to come to Edna's cabin, not to check on her, not to deliver the verdict of the women's auxiliary. They came to feel the warmth. They came to see the quilts. They came to understand how dead air could do what 9 cords of burning wood could not. And the cold was not finished. February still had teeth. And what those teeth would do to the settlement would change everything one final time. The cold that came at the end of February was not the ordinary cold of a Kansas winter. It was not the steady, predictable cold that the settlers had learned to measure and endure and complain about over coffee. It was a different animal entirely. It came from a place further north than the usual cold drawn south by a pressure system that the old-timers could feel in their joints before they could see it in the sky, and it arrived with a malice that felt personal. The temperature dropped 18 degrees in 4 hours on the afternoon of February 23rd. By sundown, the thermometer outside the general store in Three Forks read 6 below zero. By midnight, it read 22 below. By dawn of the 24th, the mercury had retreated into the bulb and refused to come out, which meant the temperature had fallen below the instrument's lowest graduation of -30. The wind came with it, not the howling dramatic wind of a blizzard, which at least had the decency to announce itself. This was a low, constant, grinding wind from the northwest that moved at 25 miles per hour without gusting, without pausing, without any variation that would have given the body a moment of relief. It was a wind that did not rage. It worked. It worked the way a file works on iron, steadily, patiently removing material with each pass. The wind chill, a concept that the settlers did not have a name for, but understood in their bones, pushed the effective temperature to something that no wooden structure in the settlement had been designed to withstand. The heat loss through the walls of every cabin and every store and every church in Three Forks accelerated to a rate that overwhelmed every stove and every woodpile and every strategy that depended on combustion as the primary defense against freezing. People burned everything. They burned their cordwood, they burned their fence rails, they burned their furniture. The Nettleton family burned their kitchen table on the second night when the cordwood ran out and the children's lips turned blue. Reverend Stanton burned the church pews, dragging them from the sanctuary to the parsonage one at a time, splitting them with an axe in the parlor, because going outside to the chopping block meant losing 10 minutes of exposure that his body could not afford. And still the cold came through. It came through the walls, through the floors, through the gaps around the windows that no amount of rags or paper could seal against a wind that found every imperfection with the patience of water finding cracks in stone. The stoves glowed red, and the rooms stayed cold because the heat was being extracted from the buildings faster than it could be produced. The arithmetic had become impossible. There was not enough wood in the settlement to maintain habitable temperatures in structures that gave their warmth away through every surface. By the third day, the situation had passed beyond discomfort into the territory of physiology. The human body maintains its core temperature of 98.6 degrees through a combination of metabolic heat production and behavioral regulation, which means clothing, shelter, and fire. When the environment overwhelms all three of these defenses, the body begins a systematic shutdown that proceeds in stages, each one quieter and more dangerous than the last. The first stage is shivering, the involuntary contraction of skeletal muscles to generate heat through friction. The second stage is vasoconstriction, the narrowing of blood vessels in the extremities to preserve blood flow to the vital organs. The third stage is the cessation of shivering, which is not a sign of warming, but a sign that the body has exhausted its muscular reserves and can no longer produce heat through contraction. The fourth stage is confusion, followed by lethargy, followed by unconsciousness, followed by death. The children reached the third stage first because their bodies were smaller and their surface area to mass ratio was higher, which meant they lost heat faster than adults in the same environment. The Crutchfield children, 3 of them, ages 4, 6, and 9, were showing the signs by the evening of the 25th. The Crutchfield cabin stood 3/4 of a mile southeast of Edna's claim, a single-room structure of cottonwood logs with a plank floor and a tar paper roof that had been state-of-the-art when it was built, and was now in the third day of the worst cold snap in a decade, a box of slow death. Tom Crutchfield had burned everything combustible in the house except the floor and the walls. The stove was running on the remains of a rocking chair his wife had brought from Ohio, and the heat it produced was being pulled through the log walls by the wind as fast as the wood could give it up. His wife Ada was holding the youngest, a girl named Pearl, wrapped in every blanket they owned, rocking her in a motion that was not comfort but desperation. Pearl had stopped shivering an hour ago. Her skin was the color of old wax. Her breathing was shallow, the slow mechanical respiration of a body that was retreating from its own surface, pulling inward, abandoning the extremities to preserve the core. Tom Crutchfield was not a man given to panic. He was a farmer. He understood seasons and cycles and the impersonal cruelty of weather. He understood that some winters were harder than others and that the correct response was to prepare better next year. But this was not next year. This was tonight, and his daughter had stopped shivering. He stood in his cabin and looked at the walls and felt the cold coming through them like radiation, invisible and relentless, and he understood that his stove could not save his children because his stove was trying to heat the prairie. Every BTU it produced was being donated to the Kansas night through walls that conducted cold as efficiently as they conducted heat, which was to say, with the indifferent competence of physics doing what physics always did. He needed wood. He did not have wood. There was no wood to be had within walking distance that was not already burning in someone else's stove or frozen to the ground under 3 feet of drift. He could not ride to the creek bottom to cut green timber because his horse had been brought into the barn 2 days ago, and he could not saddle it and ride in a wind that would freeze exposed skin in 4 minutes. He did not need wood. The thought arrived not as inspiration, but as memory. He had been to Edna Whitfield's cabin 10 days ago. One of the curious visitors who had come to see the quilted walls after Mabel Stanton's visit had made the rounds of the settlement's gossip circuit. He had stood in Edna's warm room and felt the heat that her barely burning stove maintained, and he had looked at the quilts on the walls and listened to her explanation of dead air. And he had nodded and said he'd think about it and gone home and not thought about it again, because his woodpile was still adequate, and the idea of hanging quilts on walls seemed like something a woman alone would do, not something a man with a family would need to consider. His woodpile was gone. His daughter had stopped shivering. He did not need wood. He needed quilts. Tom Crutchfield pulled on every piece of clothing he owned and went out into the cold. The walk to Edna's cabin was 3/4 of a mile, in normal conditions 12 minutes. In this wind, in this dark, in this temperature that had moved beyond measurement into the realm of pure hostility, it took him 35 minutes, and when he arrived at her door, he could no longer feel his hands or his feet or the lower half of his face. He knocked. He knocked with the flat of his forearm because his fingers had stopped working. Edna opened the outer door within a minute. She was wearing a wool dress and a shawl. Her cabin, visible through the canvas curtain behind her, was lit by a single lamp and the glow of a stove that was burning at the low economical level she had maintained all winter. She looked at Tom Crutchfield and recognized the expression on his face. It was not an expression she had to interpret. It was the expression of a man who had arrived at the end of a calculation and found zero on the other side. He said, "Mrs. Whitfield, my children, Pearl has stopped shivering. We're out of wood. I don't need wood." He paused. His breath came in shallow, frozen bursts, each one a small cloud that the wind sheared away before it could rise. He said, "I need quilts." Edna did not put on a coat. There was no time for coats. She went to the cedar chest and pulled out every quilt she had not hung on her own walls. There were two. A patchwork her mother had made from flour sack fabric, light but tightly woven, and a heavy wool comforter she had been using on her bed. She placed them in a canvas sack. She added a paper bag of wooden pegs she had carved during the long January evenings, cut to the correct length for driving into logs. She added a ball of rope. She added her 2-inch gauge block. She handed the sack to Crutchfield and said, "Hang them 2 inches from the walls, not against the wall, away from it, 2 inches. Use the pegs, use the rope. Start with the north wall. It's losing the most heat." He stared at her. His face was a mask of frost and desperation, and the instructions she was giving him sounded in the howling dark at 30 below zero like a prescription for madness. She took his arm. Her grip was strong. 62 years of grip. She held his forearm and spoke directly into the wind, and her voice carried no uncertainty, no qualification, no doubt of any kind. She said, "The dead air between the quilt and the wall will stop the cold from coming through. Your stove doesn't need to heat the prairie. It only needs to heat the room. But it can't heat the room if the room is giving the heat away through the walls. Seal the walls. Trap the air. 2 inches. Not one, not three, 2. She released his arm. She said, "Go now. Pearl needs you to hang quilts, not stand here." He went. He walked back into the wind, carrying a canvas sack of quilts and pegs and rope, and he walked the 3/4 of a mile back to his cabin in a straight line because the wind was at his back now, and he used it instead of fighting it, and he arrived at his door 20 minutes later and went inside and set the sack on the floor. Ada looked at him. She looked at the sack. She sat down. "Where's the wood?" He said. "There's no wood. There's something else." He started with the north wall. His hands were almost useless, swollen and numb, operating on the residual memory of 1,000 tasks performed in better conditions. He drove pegs into the logs with a hammer he could barely grip. He strung rope between the pegs. He hung the wool comforter 2 inches from the wall, checking the gap with the wooden gauge block Edna had included, adjusting the rope until the fabric hung straight and free of the timber. It took 40 minutes. 40 minutes in a room where his daughter lay wrapped in blankets with her core temperature dropping. 40 minutes while the stove burned the last splinters of the rocking chair from Ohio, and the cold continued its patient work through every surface. He hung the second quilt on the east wall. He used the remaining rope to seal the gaps around the door, packing them with strips cut from a flour sack. He did not have enough material for all four walls. He did not have a wind trap or an airlock. He had 2 quilts and 10 pegs and a gap of dead air on 2 of the 4 walls. It was enough. The change was not instant. It was not the dramatic, revelatory warmth that Edna had felt on her first night when every wall was sealed and every draft was killed. It was slower, subtler, measurable, not in minutes, but in the hour that followed. The stove, which had been losing its battle against the north wall for 3 days, was no longer losing. The heat it produced was staying in the room. Not all of it. The south and west walls were still bleeding warmth into the night. But the north and east walls, the 2 that faced the wind, were sealed. The dead air had formed. The cold that had been pouring through those surfaces had been interrupted by 2 inches of nothing. The temperature in the room stopped falling. It held. Then it began to rise degree by degree, in increments so small they were detectable only by the body's own instruments. The easing of a jaw that had been clenched for hours, the relaxation of shoulders that had been hunched against the cold, the slow return of feeling to fingers and toes. Pearl began to shiver. Ada made a sound when it happened. Not a word, a sound. The sound a person makes when they have been holding something so tightly that the release is involuntary, a gasp or a cry, or something in between that carries the weight of every minute spent watching a child not move. Pearl was shivering. Her body had resumed its defense. The core temperature had stabilized, and the muscles had received the signal to contract to generate heat to fight. The quilts hung motionless on the wall. The dead air held. The stove burned its last fragments of rocking chair, and then Tom fed it the only fuel remaining, which was 3 pieces of green cottonwood he had stacked beside the door and written off as useless. The green wood hissed and spat and produced a thin, reluctant flame. But the flame did not need to roar. The flame did not need to fill the room with heat. The flame only needed to maintain what the dead air was preserving. Pearl lived. All 3 children lived. And in the morning when the cold had not relented, but the cabin was holding it at 38 degrees, with a fire that would have been laughable. 3 days earlier, Tom Crutchfield sat at his kitchen table, missing its rocking chair, and stared at the 2 quilts hanging on his walls, and understood that 2 inches of air had done what 10 cords of wood could not. Mabel Stanton arrived at Edna's door on the morning of the 26th. She did not ride in the minister's wagon. She walked, which told Edna everything she needed to know, because Mabel Stanton did not walk anywhere. Mabel Stanton rode. Mabel Stanton was conveyed. The fact that she was on foot in the worst cold of the decade, wrapped in layers that made her nearly spherical, meant that something had changed at the parsonage that was beyond the capacity of 2 stoves and 11 cords of firewood to fix. Edna opened the door. She did not say anything. She held the canvas curtain aside and let Mabel pass through the wind trap and into the cabin. Mabel stood in the warmth that was impossible. The warmth that came from a stove burning so low that the fire was barely visible through the grate. The warmth that existed in a room hung with quilts, sealed with wool, insulated by a principle that Mabel had called nonsense and foreign foolishness in the delusion of a widow who had lost her mind. Mabel's spectacles fogged over immediately. She removed them and cleaned them with a corner of her scarf, and without them, her face looked different, smaller, less certain, the face of a woman standing in someone else's proof. She said, "We're out of wood. The Reverend burned the last of the pews this morning. The parsonage is 20 degrees inside and the cold isn't breaking." Edna poured coffee from the pot that had been warm all morning. She handed the cup to Mabel. Mabel took it with both hands and held it against her chest, and the steam rose between them in the still air of the cabin. Edna said, "Sit down, Mrs. Stanton." Mabel sat. She drank. She did not look at the quilts on the walls because looking at them meant seeing them, and seeing them meant understanding what she had spent 4 months denying. But the quilts were there. They were on every wall. They were 2 inches from the timber. They were holding the warmth inside this cabin the way they had been holding it since October's silent and steady and immune to the opinions of the Women's Auxiliary. Mabel said, "How do you do it?" Her voice was very quiet. It was the voice of a woman who had come to the end of what she knew and found that the end was a door she had to walk through, whether she wanted to or not. Edna sat across from her. She looked at Mabel Stanton, the minister's wife, the moral inventory clerk of Three Forks, the woman who had told everyone that the quilt widow would freeze, that a woman alone could not survive, that quilts on walls were madness, that foreign nonsense was still nonsense no matter how foreign. She could have said many things. She could have repeated Mabel's own words back to her. She could have asked how 9 cords of wood were working out. She could have delivered the precise, devastating summary of everything Mabel had gotten wrong and everything Edna had gotten right, and it would have been accurate, and it would have been justified, and it would have been satisfying for exactly as long as it took to say. She didn't. She said, "Dead air, Mrs. Stanton. Still air doesn't conduct heat. The quilts trap a layer of air between themselves and the wall. The air can't move. The cold from the wall hits the dead air and stops. That's all. It's just physics." Mabel looked at her coffee. She said, "I called it foreign nonsense." Edna said, "You did." A silence settled between them. It was not a comfortable silence, and it was not an aggressive silence. It was the silence of two women who had been on opposite sides of a question for 4 months and had arrived through very different routes at the same answer. Edna stood up. She went to the cedar chest. She had given her spare quilts to Tom Crutchfield. The chest was empty. She looked at it for a moment, and then she looked at the walls of her cabin, at the 7 quilts that were keeping her alive, and she made a calculation. She could spare 2. The south wall, which received sunlight during the day, could survive with a lighter covering. The window quilt, the star pattern from Wichita, could be replaced temporarily with the canvas drop cloth from the wind trap if she doubled the wool gaskets around the door. She took down the south wall quilt and the east wall quilt. She folded them and placed them in the canvas sack with a handful of pegs and a length of rope and the 2-inch gauge block, which had been returned by Crutchfield that morning. She handed the sack to Mabel. She said, "North wall first, 2 inches from the timber. Use the pegs at 18-inch intervals. The gauge block will give you the distance. Don't let the fabric touch the wall. The moment it touches, the dead air dies and the cold comes through." Mabel took the sack. She held it against her chest the way she had held the coffee. She looked at Edna, and her eyes behind the steel-rimmed spectacles were wet, and Edna could not tell if it was from the warmth of the cabin or from something else. Mabel said, "I owe you an apology." Edna said, "You owe me nothing. Hang the quilts. Keep your family warm. That's enough." Mabel left. She walked back into the cold carrying a sack of quilts and pegs, and she walked the 1.5 miles back to the parsonage, where the Reverend was waiting with an empty wood box and a house that was losing its heat through every surface, and she hung the quilts on the north and east walls of the parsonage, 2 inches from the timber, pegged at 18-inch intervals, gapped with a 2-inch gauge block carved by a woman she had tried to make fail. The parsonage warmed. Not much. Not the way Edna's cabin was warm with every wall sealed and every draft killed. But enough to stop the bleeding, enough to hold the temperature above the threshold where the body's systems began to shut down, enough to survive the night and the next night and the night after that, until the cold broke on the 1st of March and the temperature climbed back above zero, and the settlement emerged from the worst week of winter anyone could remember. Mabel Stanton never apologized. Not formally. Not in the way that an apology is supposed to work, with words arranged in the correct order and delivered with the appropriate expression of regret. She never acknowledged to the women's auxiliary that she had been wrong. She never told the congregation that a Swedish principal had saved her home. She never visited Edna again. But she stopped telling people that Edna needed a husband. She stopped predicting disaster. She stopped mentioning the widower in Dodge City. She stopped, and the stopping was its own kind of language, and Edna understood it, and it was enough. The cold broke on the 1st of March. The wind shifted to the south, and the temperature rose above freezing for the first time in 6 days, and the icicles on the eaves of the surviving buildings began to drip with a sound that was almost musical after the sustained silence of deep winter. The settlement took stock. No one had died. This was remarkable. This was, by the standards of Kansas frontier settlements in cold snaps of this severity, nearly miraculous. 2 children had come close. Pearl Crutchfield had come very close. But no one had crossed the line. The reason was quilts. Not in every house, not on every wall, but in the houses where they had been hung in the cabins, where 2 inches of dead air had been trapped between fabric and timber the stoves had held. The wood had lasted. The heat had stayed. And in the houses where the walls were bare, the families had survived only because they had burned everything they owned and huddled together in the center of rooms that were losing their warmth through every surface. The arithmetic was now public. It was discussed at the store, at the church, at the wells. Edna Whitfield had burned 4 cords. Mabel Stanton had burned 9. The Nettletons had burned 12. The church had burned 14, including the pews, which the Reverend would have to replace before Easter. 4 cords versus 9. 4 cords versus 12. 4 cords versus 14. The numbers did not require explanation. The numbers did not require a Swedish accent or a lecture on thermal conductivity or even the word physics. The numbers spoke the language of the prairie, which was the language of wood and labor, and the hours of a man's life spent swinging an axe. Edna Whitfield had saved 5 cords of wood. 5 cords was 2 weeks of a man's labor. 5 cords was the difference between having enough for next winter and having to start from nothing. 5 cords was money that did not need to be spent, time that did not need to be invested, energy that did not need to be burned. 5 cords was freedom. 6 families hung quilts that spring. They came to Edna's cabin and looked at her walls and listened to her explain the 2-inch gap in the dead air and the reason the fabric must not touch the timber. She showed them the frost mark from January, the ghost of the peg that failed, the evidence that the dead air was the only thing standing between warmth and cold. She did not lecture. She measured. She cut gauge blocks for each family, each one exactly 2 inches wide, and she showed them how to hold the block between the quilt and the wall and adjust the rope until the gap was uniform. She told them to use the heaviest fabric on the north wall and the lightest on the south. She told them to seal the doors and create wind traps. She told them to bank their stoves low and trust the air. She told them what Mrs. Bergstrom had told her in the same simple language and stripped of theory and dressed in practice. Still air doesn't conduct heat. Trap it and it works for you. Let it move and it works against you. 2 inches. That's the distance between freezing and surviving. 12 families hung quilts that fall before the first snow. By the winter of 1887, half the settlement had quilted walls, and the demand for heavy fabric had driven prices up at the general store. The clerk who had once smiled with faint condescension when Edna came in to buy yarn now kept a stack of batting behind the counter and recommended the double-layered variety to every customer who walked in. Mrs. Bergstrom came to see Edna in the spring of 1887 after the second winter of quilted walls. She walked slowly, leaning on a stick, her silver braids thinner than they had been, and her step less certain. She was 79 years old, and she was not going to be 80. She sat in Edna's cabin and drank coffee and looked at the quilts on the walls with the quiet satisfaction of a woman who had carried a piece of knowledge across an ocean and a continent, and 34 years of being ignored, and had finally seen it take root. She said, "You did good, Edna, better than I expected." Edna said, "You taught me." Mrs. Bergstrom shook her head. The motion was small, barely visible, the economy of a body that was conserving its remaining energy for the things that mattered. She said, "I told you a fact. You built a life on it. That's not the same thing." She was quiet for a while. The stove crackled softly. The quilts hung motionless on the walls. The dead air held. She said, "In Sweden, we learned that the cold is not an enemy. It is a fact, like the sun or the rain. You don't fight facts. You work with them. You find where the heat goes, and you stop it there. You find where the cold comes from, and you put something in its way. Still air, dead air, air that does nothing, and in doing nothing, does everything." She smiled. It was a thin smile, the kind that uses the muscles of the eyes more than the mouth. She said, Now you teach the others." Mrs. Bergstrom died in the spring of 1888, peacefully in a cabin she had quilted herself 40 years before. Edna was with her at the end, holding the hand of the woman who had stood in a general store in Three Forks, Kansas, holding a skein of wool, and spoken to the empty air about a principle that the empty air already knew. Edna Whitfield married Josiah Fenn in the autumn of 1889. He was a farmer from the next county who had come to see the quilted walls everyone was talking about. And he had looked at the quilts, and then he had looked at the woman who had hung them, and he had recognized in her face the same quality he valued in his land, which was steadiness. The quality of something that held its ground and did not give way and did not need to be loud or dramatic or remarkable to be permanent. They raised 5 children. All of them grew up in a house where the walls were quilted and the fire burned low, and the winter could not steal the warmth no matter how hard it tried. The children grew up understanding that the gap between things mattered as much as the things themselves, that 2 inches of nothing could outperform 10 cords of something, that survival was not always a matter of doing more, but was sometimes a matter of losing less. The technique spread beyond the settlement, beyond Kansas, beyond the prairie. People called it different things in different places. Quilt insulation, dead air spacing, the Swedish method. But the principle was always the same, the principle that a 78-year-old woman had spoken aloud in a general store to no one in particular, and that a 62-year-old widow had heard because she had nothing left to lose and everything left to learn. Still air does not conduct heat. Trap it and it holds your warmth. Let it move and it steals it. The physics are simple. The application requires only fabric and pegs and 2 inches of space, and the willingness to believe that the absence of something can be more powerful than the presence of everything else. The original cabin is gone now, torn down in 1923, when Edna and Josiah built a proper frame house on the same site. The frame house had double walls with a sealed air gap between them, the architectural descendant of a quilt hung on a rope. It was warm in winter and cool in summer, and it cost less to heat than any house in the county. But the quilts survived. They were passed down through generations, each one carrying the fingerprints of the women who had made them, and the story of the winter when they were hung on walls instead of spread on beds, each one carrying the memory of dead air and 2 inches and the physics of nothing. The Historical Society has one of them now. Edna's grandmother's quilt, the heaviest one, the one with the double wedding ring pattern, and the wool batting that still holds its loft after a century and a half. The one that hung on the north wall that first November, facing the wind that came down from Canada, holding the line between cold and warm, with nothing but fabric and air. The display card explains the dead air principle. It mentions that the technique was brought to Kansas by Swedish immigrants. It notes that it was popularized by a widow named Edna Whitfield, who refused to freeze when everyone expected her to. It does not mention Mabel Stanton. It does not mention the 9 cords of wood, or the women's auxiliary meeting, or the widower in Dodge City who never received a letter. It does not mention the night at 3 in the morning when Edna lay in the dark and touched the quilt on the wall and felt warmth on one side and cold on the other, and understood that the 2 inches between them were the 2 most important inches in her life. But the quilt remembers. The principle survives. And somewhere in Kansas, in houses old enough to have seen a century of winters, there are probably still walls hung with fabric 2 inches from the timber, where dead air does the work that fire cannot, where warmth is held instead of produced, where the gap between things is the thing that matters most. Some stories end with the hero defeating the villain. This one ends with something warmer and quieter. A woman who refused to burn her way through winter, who learned that the air between things could matter more than the things themselves, who survived not by doing more, but by losing less, who sat in a cabin at 62 years old alone, in the middle of Kansas, in the middle of January, in the middle of the worst winter anyone could remember, and drank warm coffee from a pot that stayed warm all morning because the heat had nowhere to go. 4 cords and 9 cords. That was the distance between understanding and ignorance, between physics and pride, between a woman who listened to a Swedish grandmother in a general store and a woman who didn't. 2 inches. That was the distance between freezing and surviving, and the dead air held.